right, so we are continuing our 1 Samuel Bible series. We made some progress. We're in chapter 18 today, and we're actually going to mostly cover 18, and then I'm going to go more quickly through chapter 19. So it's 18 and 19, but most of the time will be in 18. We'll spend a little bit more time in the meat of the word on that section of the Bible. And if you remember, in the very previous chapter, David slew Goliath. That was the, slaying of the giant, Goliath of Gath. And Saul asked David, he said, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." And if you remember, it said that he loved David, and it was just, glorious scene of victory. And then 1 Samuel 18:1, we'll see how quickly things change and things shift here. 1 Samuel 18:1 begins, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." Remember, we were introduced to Jonathan. He was a bold man of faith, as opposed to the cowering, fearful nature of Saul, his father. So, Jonathan, we've just got a great image of Jonathan. And at this point, his soul, it says, was knit together with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So thus begins the great friendship in the Bible between David and Jonathan. It says that their souls were knit together, and there's no greater example of friendship in the entirety of the Bible, other than, of course, Jesus himself, than that of David and Jonathan. In fact, as we read through this, you'll see that Jonathan is a type of, or a foreshadow of Christ as friend, where the Bible says that Jesus is our friend and he intercedes for us, and he no longer calls us slaves, but friend. We'll see that Jonathan takes that role in the Old Testament to David. And there's no greater example of that kind of friendship than that of David and Jonathan. Jesus said in John 15:13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." So the most greatest type of love is self-sacrificial love, when you're willing to die for someone else. That's the true mark of love. It's very easy to say, "Oh, I love you, brother," and I love you, man, and all this stuff. But ultimately, the mark of real love is if you're willing to lay down your own life for that person. And that's the example that we get in John 15:13. That's how you know if you really do truly love someone. Are you willing to die for them? And that's what Jonathan was willing to do for David, and vice versa. They were the very best of friends that we see in the Bible. In the second book of Samuel, David would say to Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1:26, "I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women." And so that's a big statement to make. There's a deep love that occurs between a man and a woman when they fall in love, right? But David said that his love for Jonathan even surpassed the love between a man and a woman. So they were the greatest of friends. They were soulmates, so to speak, as friends. Not in the romantic sense, but their souls were knit together. They were very close friends. But David said that his love for Jonathan even surpassed the love between a man and a woman. But because of this great love, this great pure love between David and Jonathan, many have used the example of their deep and loyal friendship for their own political agendas. And I just want to begin with this today. I want to get it out of the way, just spend like 10 minutes on it and give you some of what some of the woke crowd are saying and propagating about the great love between David and Jonathan. And then we'll get that out of the way because it's something that does need to be addressed. And then we'll get to the meat of the sermon and the real friendship between Jonathan and David. But there are classes being taught at universities, so-called Christian universities. including one entitled The Queerness of David and Jonathan at universities like SMU, the Southern Methodist University. Okay, so-called Methodists, which contends that because of the way that the Bible describes the great love and commitment between David and Jonathan, that they were queer, that they were gay. They have entire courses being taught on this called Queer Bible Hermeneutics at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas, Texas, of all places. So here's a portion of the curriculum. It states the story of David and Jonathan is one of those great mysteries of homoeroticism in the Bible, and that the relationship between David and Jonathan is queer. So this is a college-level course. This is what they're teaching. When I just read to you from the book of 1 Samuel, your first instinct wasn't to think, oh man, those guys are gay, right? It was, wow, what a beautiful friendship between two men, that kind of friendship is possible between two kind of men. And so David and Jonathan are being used wildly out of context to further the LGBT agenda. And I've heard people, it's not just limited to the college universities. I've debated people on this topic. I've heard people from the LGBT community say to me, oh, what about David and Jonathan? You know, they were gay. And so this is so outside the scope and valid interpretation of the Bible that you'd literally have to be an unbelieving queer to believe this. This kind of interpretation is so wildly misrepresentative of the context and the culture of ancient Israel. Right? I mean, Israel was very against this. David and Jonathan loved the law of the Lord. You know, they were men of God. They were warriors. They loved Leviticus 18:11 and Leviticus 20:13 and Deuteronomy 25:11. Just go look up those verses and you'll see what David and Jonathan believed about this topic, because they loved the law of the Lord. They were dedicated men of God, warriors in the sight of the Lord, holy and sanctified and set apart. They were types of Christ in the Bible. They were examples of Christ in the Old Testament. But this article further states, is there a fixation with the uncircumcised giant, the italicized uncircumcised giant, Goliath? In chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, the mystery of how a child killed a giant is recorded. From the very beginning, the infatuation of the phallus is apparent. Okay, I'm almost like ashamed to even read this to you in church. It's what? Yeah, it's terrible, right? So, but, you know, we need to expose this stuff. And, you know, this can only come out of a sick and perverted mind that has been subverted from the truth. This is a woke, liberal, leftist interpretation of the deep and meaningful friendship that David and Jonathan shared. Has anyone run across this before besides me? I mean, I ran across this. You have. You've heard it, right? So the article states, Jonathan sees a stripling, which means a young man or a youth, so they're kind of insinuating pedophilia here as well, and becomes infatuated with him. So the LGBT propaganders claim also, aside from pushing this, that later when David and Jonathan make a covenant with one another, that the covenant that they make signified a secret marriage between David and Jonathan. Okay, forget that there's nothing in the text to indicate any of this. And you thought the Gnostics were bad with their hidden esoteric meanings and their secret, meanings of the Bible. This is far worse than a Gnostic reading. They're doing a classic eisegesis of the Bible. In other words, they're reading into the text exactly what they want it to mean, which is completely intellectually dishonest, right? It's just a dishonest reading of the Bible. They're seeing what they want to see instead of what it's saying. The article states, in God's protection of David, I believe that the queerness became established through the spiritual connection united amid two beings operating under the prophetic. I mean, so they're really taking the sacred, the holy, and profaning it here. What they're basically saying is that love is love, and that God approves. But the problem with that is that Jonathan and David are a perfect example of how you can have a healthy, natural, loving relationship between two men and two women without the perversion of lust and other, so-called queerness. Okay, there's nothing wrong with two men loving one another or two women loving one another and showing, being knit together. I've had friends like that where we're very close, but it doesn't move beyond that. So no one's saying you can't have, love between the same sex. But it's just, we don't move into sexual perversion. Finally, there's a scene in which Jonathan strips himself of his royal garb, and we'll get to that in the text today. And he gives his clothing to David as a sign of his fealty to him, of his devotion. Let me see if I can grab that verse real quick. And I'll just read it to you in 1 Samuel.
18:4.
Thank you. 1 Samuel 18:4. We'll get to that in the message, in the real message today. But 1 Samuel 18:4, they're going to comment on this. It says, "And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle." Okay, so there's this scene that we're going to talk about today where Jonathan strips himself of his royal garbs, of his royal robe. This was the princely clothing that he was wearing and as the prince, as the son of King Saul, and he gives it all to David. Well, Jonathan had just encountered the anointed, the Lord's anointed. This was David, the shepherd boy, who was anointed king, and he was in the shepherd's clothing. And what Jonathan was saying by this is that, you're a prince among us. And he's giving his royal authority, his princely garbs, over to David as to signify that his loyalty is to David as the prince of the land. In essence, he was saying that he knew that David was the next king. He understood that it wouldn't be he himself as the next rightful heir, but that giving his clothing over to David was signifying that he's the prince and he's going to be the next king instead of Jonathan. But the reprobate queer professor at SMU interprets it this way. She says, "The queerness became established through the spiritual connection united among two beings operating under the prophetic. I state this because when Samuel protects David, each time the king sends servants to seize David and frenzy overtakes them, moving them to prophesy and strip their clothing. Again, the act of participating in a ritual that is not normative expresses queerness. The men are engaged in a nude frenzy, all in the name of Yahweh or Jehovah." So what a raw, just the words, I can't say the words that come to mind. This is a classic, abomination. It's this entire class is an abomination of Satan. How can a Methodist theological seminary be teaching this under the banner of Christ? It's truly an abomination, like the Bible says. It's the reason why Leviticus 20:13 was written. The longer that I go along in this society and I see exactly what's happening, there's a reason why God wrote Leviticus 20:13. If you go look up exactly what that means. Now, I know under the New Testament, under the New Covenant, anybody can come and get saved. You can all get saved, but look at what's happened to society by not following God's law and allowing this kind of propaganda to continue. So to end on this, in the course description, they say that their class is the study of the historical, political, cultural, and religious theological discourses about gender and sexuality in the context of the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Grounded in an interdisciplinary approach, the course develops self-critical perspectives about the influence of biblical meanings on hermeneutically dynamic. That means they're fluid and dynamic in how they understand hermeneutics, which is the interpretation of the Bible. Okay, hermeneutics is simply how you interpret and study the Bible. So they're hermeneutically dynamic, politically and religiously charged conversations over socio-cultural practices related to LGBTQ communities. That's their syllabus. That's their course description. And so, these churches are not operating under the Spirit of Christ. The Holy Spirit is not there. These are satanic teachings. These are satanic colleges. And just this morning, another example of this is I was just looking at different videos online, and there was a video from the Progressive Baptist Church, it was called. The Progressive Baptist Church. And they were, it was a black preacher, and he was preaching about, how under Obama, this was like a couple years ago, or under Biden, which is worse than Obama, under Biden, that now black and brown people are more protected. And now we're safe now that this racist Trump is gone, is basically what he was saying. And, and promoting COVID and promoting all this kind of progressivism inside the church as a Baptist church. And so these are not Baptist churches. These churches are not operating by the Spirit of God. These are churches doing the devil's work. And by the way, why do we still have black churches? Isn't that segregation? We don't have white churches. We don't have, brown churches. We just have black churches still. It's a remnant of a segregated era. I mean, the very definition of racism is segregation. So, I don't know what that's about, but this is the kind of stuff that's being promulgated out there, that's spreading in these progressive leftist circles. So moving on from this abomination of the sacred, let's get back to the Bible. 1 Samuel 18:1 says, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Look at the purity of that verse, right? This is a rare, once-in-a-lifetime type of friendship among friends. I've had very few friends in my lifetime that I can truly say my soul was knit together with them. I can honestly, think of one, maybe two, where I could say we had that kind of a friendship. So this speaks of the importance of friendship. We might have a lot of acquaintances, a lot of friends, but do you have friends like Jonathan and David? That is, deep friendship. And that's what we see here. And so the topic of today's sermon, as we get past some of this initial stuff, is the importance of friendship. And there are so many great Bible verses on this in the Bible that we'll cover today. And it's just so important, for our children, for our friends, for our youth, for ourselves, to have friends, to have good friends. And we need to do everything we can to cultivate those friendships. But there's so many great verses on this. Proverbs 18:24 says, there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. That was the relationship between David and Jonathan. They were family. They were like brothers. It says, in fact, they were closer than brothers, right? There's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother, even a family. Sometimes we have family relationships that have fallen apart. I have, members of my family where we're not close in some ways. They're not believers, or it's been a dysfunctional, relationship. But I have friends that I consider my true brothers, right? In the Lord, brothers in the Lord. And so this Bible verse is just a great verse. There's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. So we need to value those friendships and hang on to those friendships. Their souls here were knit together. In 1 Samuel 18:2, we get a contrast. It says, and Saul took him that day, speaking of David, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Notice that whereas Jonathan loved David, by contrast, Saul takes him. It says he takes him. He possesses him. He wouldn't let him go back to his father's house. David is a prisoner in Saul's castle or his palace. He's been conscripted into Saul's army. Saul saw what he did with Goliath, how he defeated this great giant, and he possesses him as his own for his own army. So God warned Israel what would happen when they asked for a king. We saw that back in 1 Samuel 8:11. It's exactly what he warned. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. So Saul literally took David, just like the Bible warned. Verse 13, And he will take your daughters to be confectioners and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards. In verse 15, and he will take the tenth of your seed, and he will take your men servants, and he will take the tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his servants. As you go through those, few verses in 1 Samuel 8, it's just he will take, he will take, he will take, he will take. Saul didn't love David, he needed him, and so he took him. So in your relationships, are you a Jonathan or are you a Saul? Right? That's how you can evaluate your relationships with other people. Is it possessive, or is it that you just love them and your soul is knit together with them? 1 Samuel 18, 3-4. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle. So why did Jonathan do this? As I talked about, what does this mean? Well, first they make a covenant, right? Because he loved him, he promises him, he makes a covenant before God of friendship and fealty. Then Jonathan takes off his robe, his sword, his bow, and he gives it all to David. It's an act of surrender to David. It's an act of surrender to God's anointed who is about to be king. Jonathan is Saul's son. He's the next in line to be king. But by this act, he's declaring that David would be king and that Jonathan would serve him and be loyal to him. So that was the covenant that they were making. It wasn't a marriage covenant. It wasn't them like running around naked and just being perverse. It was taking the royal garments of the prince in the palace and saying, you are that mighty prince. You are, the son and the prince that God has anointed. And Jonathan would submit to that as an anointed man of God himself. So that's what he was declaring. This was the prince clothes being given to David. David would no longer be clothed in the simple garbs of a shepherd boy, but clothed in royal apparel. And so this was what this covenant signified. So a good friend will lift you up and bring out the best in you. He'll treat you like a prince, like royalty. And unlike that armor that Saul tried to give to David, remember when he gave him his armor and it wouldn't fit him? Well, Jonathan's clothing fit David perfectly. They were kindred souls, soulmates, you could say, as friends. His clothing fit where Saul's clothing was wrong for him. His armor was wrong for him. He was much more like Jonathan than David. Jonathan than Saul. 1 Samuel 18:5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So I like how it says David behaved himself wisely among Saul's men. David had every reason to boast. He had just, slain Goliath. He could have had a huge head and just being like, yeah, I'm the giant slayer, and, I'm the new anointed. I'm going to be king eventually. But he remained humble. He didn't let it go to his head. And he behaved himself wisely in front of Saul and his men. And so David is given much authority over Saul's army. He's the top man at this point. As the man who slew Goliath, he's set in charge over the men of war. And he behaves himself wisely. 1 Samuel 18:6-9. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have? More but the kingdom. And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. So things sour quickly. Saul is jealous. He's possessive. He's envious. These are not signs of friendship, right? So we have a contrast between Jonathan and David and Saul. And, Saul is possessive, he's angry, he's jealous, he's selfish, he's thinking about himself. And from that point on, he kind of gets a clue. He realizes that, hey, David could take the kingdom from me. Remember, he knows that it was prophesied against him that the kingdom would be torn from him. Samuel had prophesied this. The Spirit of God had left him. And so now he's both possessive and jealous, seeing that David could, well, in fact, be the new king. And it says he eyes David from that day forward. He's got his eyes on him, right? Kind of picture Robert De Niro doing the thing to David. And so we're seeing a healthy illustration of friendship from Jonathan and a destructive one from King Saul. And that contrast is hard to miss. David is now the enemy, someone to be watched and is, to be feared. 1 Samuel 18:10 through 11. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. So his anger and his jealousy leads to murder. He started out loving David in the previous chapter, and how quickly that turned, that love, that there's they say there's a fine line between love and hate, and how quickly that can turn because of anger and jealousy and possessiveness. So this escalates quickly. And he literally tries to kill David. 1 Samuel 18:12. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. And so that was the issue. The anointing had left Saul and was firmly resting on David, and Saul knew it. He knew his kingdom was at stake, and he was jealous for his kingdom. Verse 13, therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very, very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So it's interesting how many times it says that Saul was afraid of David. He was afraid that he was going to lose that kingdom, the kingdom to David. But both Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. David was truly a man of the people. He wasn't aloof in his royal court. He stood with his men. He was among them, and that's a sign of good leadership. He was just one of the people. He was right there with them. 1 Samuel 18:7 through 9. And Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? So again, he's remaining humble. Verse 19, but it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, the Mahalathite, to wife. So here Saul attempts to kill David again. It's just another way to kill him. Instead of killing him by his own spear and by his own hand, he decides to just keep sending him into battle. Send him into battle enough times, and David, will likely be eventually slain. And he uses his own daughter to do this, to deceive David. He says, I'll give you my daughter to wife, to wed, if you go in and slay these Philistines. But all this turns out to be a lie because he gives his daughter to another. And of course, God was with David. No matter what Saul would try to do, David could not be killed. Remember when Jesus said, it's not his time? He knew he was going to die, but it wasn't his time yet to die. So God has a providential time for all of us to live and to die. It says, the Bible says that life and death are in the hands of God. So we don't need to fear. If we're anointed to do a task, we don't need to be afraid. And we shouldn't be foolish and test God and do stupid things, right? But when we know we're walking in the will of the Lord, nothing can touch us, and nothing could touch David. 1 Samuel 18:20. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, some people say Michal, but I think it's Michal originally. And Michal, Saul's daughter loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. Between one of my daughters, between one of these two. Now he gives him Michal. And he tries to use Michal to try to kill David, again, to send him into battle with an outrageous dowry that he would demand of the foreskins of the Philistines, as we'll see. But ironically, turns out Michal is going to help David in the next chapter, and we'll get to that in a minute. But 1 Samuel 18:22, and Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David. And David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? So there is real humility still there with David, despite it all. You know, David is not lightly esteemed at all, but that's how he sees himself. 1 Samuel 18:24 through 27. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall ye say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins and gave it them in full tale to the king. He's like telling the story, and that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. So David ends up delivering twice the amount of the foreskins of the Philistines. God's hand is with David. Nothing can stop this man. He's been anointed to be the next king of Israel, although it's going to be at least another decade before that promise comes to pass of becoming king. And so we'll see, how that progresses as we read through the book of Samuel, as David ends up having to run for his life. But there are promises, that take time. God has given us certain promises in our lives and certain anointings to do certain things, but we have to be patient for those things. Again, it took David a decade or more after this point in biblical history to actually become the next king of Israel. 1 Samuel 18:28 through 30. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. Saul's just been kind of cowardly, right, the whole time since he became king. And Saul became David's enemy continually. Verse 30. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. Okay, so 1 Samuel 19. We're seeing the conflict, right, arise and the tensions increase between David and Saul. 1 Samuel 19, 1 through 3. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. Now it's just outright. He's a marked man. Now he's got assassins after David. He tells all of his men, these are like the men of war, the valiant men of Israel, all of them, to come and to assassinate David. Verse 2, But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself in the morning, until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. So Saul had even told Jonathan to kill David, but David disobeys his father. One of the very few instances where that's okay, right? If your father's saying, go out and kill someone, you don't have to obey that commandment, right? So we need to obey authority even when we don't like it, or when we don't understand the reasons why we're being told that, unless it's a sin, right? So, and I'm not talking about governmental authority, and I'm talking about father and son, father and daughter, mother and daughter, even governmental authority, right? If it's not a sin, it's a good thing. God has placed those government institutions in place to keep law and order, but we just know that system's out of whack. So I want to give a little bit of a admonition to be careful there. But, we're to obey authority even when we don't understand it, right? Even if we don't like it, and be happy about it, right? Unless it's directly a sin. So here again, we see that Jonathan comes through for David as a loyal friend. We're seeing what true friendship really looks like. He begins to intercede for David. He tells David exactly what's coming. And Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12 is one of the greatest verses about friendship. And it says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So there's a lot of wisdom in the words of Solomon there, who in fact happens to be David's son, right? So I just like how that continues that line of wisdom from David to Solomon. And so all along we've seen the importance of friendship in the example of Jonathan and David. And we see him coming to his rescue here. Well, let's finish the rest of chapter 19. We'll just kind of go more quickly through it, because really what's happening here is pushing forward the narrative in the next chapter. But we'll stop and I'll comment where it's relevant. So 1 Samuel chapter 19. We just read verses 1 through 3. So verse 4. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. So he begins to intercede on behalf of David to his father and to the king. And so there's a picture of Christ in that. It's being a friend, it's being our intermediary, and he's interceding on David's behalf, not only to his father but to the king. Right? That's a picture of Christ, except Saul is not Christ, and this is the example that we have in Christ is a much greater example where Jesus intercedes to his father and to his king. And to the King of the universe. It's a perfect sacrifice. So we have a much greater witness and example of that in Jesus to Christ. Verse 5, from Jesus Christ to the Father. Verse 5, For he did put his life in his hand and slew the Philistine, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. So this does not last long. It was probably insincere. In verse 7, And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all those things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And so things kind of go back to normal for just a little short time. Verse 8, And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So twice now he tries to kill him in the palace with his javelin. And this time David's like, okay, I'm out of here, right? He runs this time. It says he fled. That promise that as the Lord liveth, David won't be killed was just a blatant lie, especially when that evil spirit, like Saul is like schizophrenic at this point, practically, right? With that evil spirit coming upon him and causing him in many ways to do this. But what's interesting about that is that evil spirit was from the Lord, right? It was God who sent that evil spirit to Saul to drive David out and to bring him into this great trial, which would eventually make him king, right? So this was all a part of God's greater, bigger plan. It was part of God's sovereignty, everything that was about to, that David was about to endure for the next decade, 10 plus years. So this was all God's doing. And a believer can't be possessed. Notice that it always says came over Saul, never went in Saul. And so the Bible is very clear about that. These 3 or 4 times that the Bible mentions this evil spirit, not once does it ever say that an evil spirit entered Saul, like it did Judas. We know it entered Judas. Judas was unsaved. It says he was a devil from the beginning, but it never entered Saul because, as I talked about, Saul was actually saved. He was just a terrible Christian. He was just a poor, example of a believer. And we'll get to that more in the very end when Saul is near the end of his life, and we'll talk about that a bit. But verse 10, we just read, and David fled and escaped that night. And then verse 11, Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And so she becomes, ironically, Saul was using Michal, his daughter, to try to kill David, but she ends up being the one that helps him and saves him. Again, this was the Lord's doing. God was turning everything around to David's benefit. Verse 13, And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with a cloth. Now, that word image, when it says that Michal took an image, in the underlying text, that's a teraphim. And so a teraphim was an idol. Okay, so this was a household idol in the household of Saul. And so remember, we had just come out of the period of the Judges when Israel was in great apostasy and was worshiping idols and was, worshiping false gods. They had household idols. Like each house had their own little idols, that they'd set up. And so this was the state of Israel in this transitory period between being, a theocracy and an anarchy and then a monarchy eventually. And so Michal still had an idol in her house. And she takes that idol, that image, it says, and Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with a cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image, a teraphim, in the bed, with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said unto me, Let me go, why should I kill thee? And so she covers for David, she covers for herself, so that Saul doesn't, kill her or punish her or do something to her. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel to Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt in Naioth. And it was told Saul, saying, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So David was untouchable at this point. The Spirit of God stopped those messengers, those assassins, from going in to kill David. They run into where, Saul is, sending these messengers. David's hiding out with Samuel there, with the prophets. And as soon as they get there, they all start to prophesy also. They're kind of like stopped in their tracks. The Spirit of God comes over them. And instead of killing David, they start to prophesy. So verse 21, and when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they prophesied also. So 3 times, this is no accident. Again, fear not. The Bible tells us, fear not. Don't be afraid. Even if you're running for your life, if God wants to preserve your life, he's going to preserve your life. And if he doesn't want to preserve your life, if it's time to go home and meet Jesus, then hallelujah, it's time to go home and meet Jesus, right? So fear not. Be bold in the Lord. Go out and do his will and preach and stand up for what's right and for righteous things. That's what we need in our churches today. Verse 22, then went he also to Ramah and came to a great well that is in Secu. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they be at Naioth in Ramah. And so Saul goes himself this time. He's like, I got to do everything myself. So he goes himself. And verse 23, and he went thither to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. Verse 24, and he stripped off his clothes also, and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Wherefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? So God kind of humiliates Saul here, right? He's like stripped down naked, prophesying. It's an interesting image. It's not just random there. There's a reason why God has him strip off all his clothes, because again, those were the royal garbs. That was the kingly, clothing, the kingly royal robes. And so Saul was being stripped of his power. He was being stripped of his authority. He was being stripped of his kingdom. And he was just naked before the Lord. Naked, he came into the world, and naked he would go back home. Poor paraphrase, but you know the verse in Job, right? Naked came I. So, Saul was losing the kingdom here. And so that's where we leave off. David is now fled. His friendship with Jonathan, by the way, is torn apart because of this evil father, because of Saul. They wouldn't see each other again. And so this was now a great journey that David was going to be taking and just fighting and fleeing for his life until the moment that he would become king for about 10 years or just a little longer. So we'll get to that next time. We'll continue in 1 Samuel 21.